In this video, we'll use the stencil we created in the last video to add details to our model. To bring it in, all we have to do now is just drag and drop those stencils right into Substance Painter, and we'll get it right inside of our shelf, and then we can drag it into our stencil. I have a new fill layer with a black mask here called White Paint, and all I have to do is take this stencil, just like the one we used before for the grips, and line it up in our viewport so we can paint on top of the objects that we're looking for, making sure I'm set to orthographic view. And if I come over to this lock section, making sure my brush is on white and my space is set to UV, we can see we can paint the words right onto the surface. Let's pop into our side-by-side view. And we can see now that it's applied that on top of the unwrap. So let's go over to the other side where we want to do release. We can just pan over, make sure everything's pretty even. And because we're in UV, it's going to actually paint straight through. It'll ignore what's over top of it. So you can see it did paint release all the way through, although it did kind of cast a little paint on the underside of this whole thing. So we just go back with painting back in black, and we can use this little eraser tool to erase any of these this paint we've already put in. But I do this I like to do this with fill layers and masks because it lets me change things like the paint color and roughness and maybe even a little bit of height information after the fact. So let's erase away this other extra text that we had in here. And we can move on to the next bit. I'm going to create a new layer, and this time it's going to be named Gold Paint. And just like before, I can add a black mask, drop in my stencil, and by holding S and doing the right, middle, and left mouse buttons, I can pan, I can scale, and I can rotate just my stencil. So between moving my viewport and moving my stencil, I get a lot of control over where it's going to go. I want to rotate my stencil so it feels like it hits the right line, and I know that my power buttons and my Fujinon little logo should be relatively sized to each other based on the stencil. So I want to make sure I pick a location for everything and then I don't zoom in or out after I set the next piece. So I'm paying attention to where the power off and the 1 and 2 power on standby, activate stabilizing standby, should be located on this top piece. So I'm going to start speeding up my process here because you'll see it more or less covers the same techniques that I'm doing already, just different areas and different regions, painting and erasing in. And then I can choose my color of paint. And choose its reflectivity. See how that looks when I change its glossiness. Now I want to make sure my size is still relatively correct, and I'm going to paint in the Fujinon logo. And I'm going to add a little spot for my green paint here. This is one of the things I really think is really cool about this particular step. To me, this is when kind of all the work pays off and texturing is just fun because I get to see all the modeling I've done, all the baking I've done, the high poly, the low poly, the UV unwrapping, and I get to just start adding little details like this that really start bringing the level of realism out. So I'm going to combine all of those together into a single layer. So this will just be my paint layer, just a little organization. And now I'm going to add the little badge icon. Something, again, I could have modeled out, but I've done it. I'm going to do the whole thing with stencils instead. I'm going to use a fill layer, and a black mask and paint in where I want a square, and I'm just using the color difference to tell where it's going to be. It needs to be a slightly different gray. And I'm going to use that blur and layers trick that I did before to get some nice round edges to everything. Just play with the height a little bit so I can inset it. And then I duplicate that. And I'm going to use color so I can, like a nice red color, so I can tell where the effect is happening. And then I use my blur and my levels, and so this is going to help show me what I'm working with here. So I can get some nice, like, rounded edges, and I can shrink it relative to the rest of the object. And then I just turn color off, turn height back on, and then adjust the levels on both sides of this a little bit. Give it a nice little group to go into. And adjust my stencil just so we can get the Fujinon part of this logo right over the badge. And now that I have that painted into the logo part, I can use height and give it a little metallic color. And it gives it a nice embossed look right away. Much quicker than if I tried to model that all by hand. The next thing I want to address is the little degrees indicators that are on the view lenses. So I make a new fill layer. I'm going to name this one degrees and throw a black mask in it. And just stencil the 70 and the 60 in one at a time. I turn off my other layers and I'm going to put a red color onto degrees so that I can see where it's being painted on. And once I have a position I like, I'm just going to use a simple alpha, one of these little dot-based ones. This shape paraboloid with a little hardness will work just fine. And I can make a couple of dots and just try to space those out manually. It's a pretty small feature, so I don't have to be too careful with it. Once I have that, I can turn off the color and focus on the height value. And control it with a blur filter and a levels filter, just like I do with the other features. In this case, I replace that levels with the clamp filter. It gives me a little bit more control. And finally, I have the little stripe to show where everything's lined up. And I also have a similar stripe on the bottom of this viewport that's going to show me, it's sort of shows me what I have selected in terms of the plus and minus here. So I'm going to make another eyepiece normal. And pick this shape capsule because it's going to give me some nice round edges. You don't have to be, it's a pretty simple shape, so I'm just going to stamp it out. And then erase away the rest that I don't need. Add a new filth layer, and this time we're looking for the CE. The process for these next pieces is pretty similar, so I'm going to speed up through this, and you can just see where I apply them and, watch the same techniques. But just so you know, I'm doing the exact same thing where I create a fill layer, I make a mask for it, I paint through it, and then I start adjusting the height, give it a little blur every now and again with a clamp to get some more control over it. But other than that, it's the exact same process.